Sopris Canyon, Las Animas County, Colorado, September 1926. The air, already thin at 7,000 feet, carried the first sharp promise of winter down from the Sangre de Cristos. Along the dusty track of the coal camp, the men sawed and hammered, reinforcing their board and batten company houses against the coming cold. All but one. Kyriakos Papadakis was not reinforcing his cabin. He was building a new one, and he was building it in a place no one had ever considered a home. He worked not on the camp's designated plot, but a quarter-mile up the canyon, at the base of a towering sandstone bluff. There, a vast, scooped-out overhang formed a natural rock shelter, 24 feet deep and nearly 100 feet wide. It was a place the children used for shade in the summer, a place where sheep huddled during a downpour. It was not a place to live. Yet inside this gaping stone mouth, Papadakis was meticulously erecting a tiny 14-foot A-frame cabin. He used finished pine, milled clean and new, a stark contrast to the rough, weathered sandstone surrounding it. The camp foreman, a man named Jedediah Potts, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Papadakis's neatly stacked lumber. "What in God's name is this, Papadakis? You building a dollhouse for the chipmunks?" Kyriakos, a man of compact build with hands as rough as the rock he knew so well, did not stop his work. He set a plumb line against a vertical stud. "Building a house, Mr. Potts." "A house? In a cave?" Potts let out a laugh that echoed in the stone alcove. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. The damp will rot that lumber in a month. The rock will sweat ice all winter. You'll be living in a tomb, man. A freezing, wet tomb." The mockery was immediate and universal. The other miners, mostly Irish and Italian, would stop on their way to or from the C&W rail line to watch the strange Greek build his house inside a hole. They called it Papadakis's folly. They joked he was half gopher. Even the children, who once played in the cave, now stood at a distance, whispering. The consensus was clear. The quiet man from the old country, the one who spoke in clipped, careful sentences, had finally gone mad from the altitude. The structure itself was a violation of common sense. It was a building inside a building, a fragile wooden triangle tucked into a gaping stone maw. It was redundant, wasteful, and deeply, profoundly foolish. The official condemnation came in the form of Halvor Bjorgen, the county mine district inspector. Bjorgen was a tall, severe Norwegian, a man who believed in regulations, right angles, and the proven methods of the frontier. He arrived in late October, his Ford Model T kicking up a cloud of ochre dust. He carried a clipboard and a look of profound disapproval. He took measurements, made notes, and shook his head. "Mr. Papadakis," he began, his voice flat and authoritative, "I've already filed a preliminary report with the mine office in Trinidad. This structure is a clear violation of the 1919 Colorado Mine Safety Act, Section 4, Paragraph B. No residential dwelling may be erected within 200 feet of an abandoned mine adit or natural cave formation suitable for mining exploration." Kyriakos wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze calm. "This is not a mine, Mr. Bjorgen. This is a cliff." Bjorgen's jaw tightened. "It is a geological feature that falls under the statute's purview. It is unsafe. It is unsanctioned. And frankly, it is the most ill-conceived attempt at a winter shelter I have ever witnessed in my 15 years as an inspector. You are building in shadow, inviting moisture, and creating a perfect trap for cold air. I am citing you today. You have until spring to dismantle it." He handed a slip of paper to Kyriakos, whose calloused fingers accepted it without a tremor. The inspector turned to leave, his final word hanging in the air. "You and your family will freeze in there." What did this Cappadocian Greek rock-cut mason, a man whose ancestors had carved entire cities from the soft volcanic tuff of Anatolia, understand about cave mass coupling and thermal reservoirs that a professional mine district inspector, a man of paper and rules, had so completely missed? I promise you, if you stick with me through this story, you will understand not only how Kyriakos Papadakis and his family stayed warm through one of Colorado's most brutal winters, but you will also learn the fundamental physics of thermal mass that modern eco-architects are only now rediscovering. This isn't just a story of one man's strange idea. It's a masterclass in forgotten wisdom. So do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and tell me in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? To understand why Kyriakos built his house in a cave, you must understand that he was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer. He was not, in the American sense, a frontiersman, accustomed to shaping wood and sod. Kyriakos Papadakis was a man of stone. His people, the Cappadocian Greeks of Sinassos and the surrounding villages near Gerima, had not built on the land for 1,000 years. They had built within it. He was a man whose hands understood the language of tufa, basalt, and sandstone. His trade was not measured in board feet, but in the patient removal of rock to reveal a chamber, a church, a home. His tools were the pick, the chisel, and an ancestral knowledge of how stone breathes. He and his wife, Eleni, and their 2 small children, Nikos and Sophia, had arrived in southern Colorado 3 years prior, part of a wave of Greeks seeking work in the booming coal fields and smelters of the West. They had left a world of rock-cut courtyards and subterranean chapels for the clapboard chaos of a company town. Their first winter, in 1924, had been a brutal education in the failures of American frontier construction. They were assigned a standard-issue company shack, single-plank walls, a single brick chimney, and a roof that sang a different tune with every shift of the wind. That winter was a lesson in physics, taught by the merciless hand of suffering. The card from the mine office, detailing Kyriakos's first winter experience, reads like a litany of thermal failure. He had seen a fellow brakeman's iron switch lever, thick as a man's wrist, bend and deform when pulled with force, the metal made brittle by the deep cold. In the assay office, the clerk's ink froze solid on the nib of his pen, turning his neat columns of figures into a trail of useless, icy scratches on the page. Most hauntingly, Kyriakos's own heavy wool overcoat, hanging on a peg near the door of their shack, had grown so rigid with frost that when he took it down one morning, the shoulder seam cracked open with a sound like breaking wood. Inside their cabin, life was a constant, losing battle against the cold. The walls were conduits, not barriers. Every nailhead that pierced the thin pine boards from the outside acted as a tiny, perfect conductor, transmitting the 20-degree air inward. On the inside of the cabin, each nail grew a delicate, cruel flower of white frost. Eleni was constantly stuffing rags into the gaps around the window frames, but it was like trying to patch a sieve. The wind, a physical presence, moved through the house at will. At night, they would huddle together in one bed, buried under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the dark. In the morning, the water in the bucket by the stove would be a solid block of ice. The cold was not just outside, it was inside in their bones, a constant, exhausting pressure. The problem wasn't a lack of fuel. The company sold them coal, and Kyriakos burned it prodigiously. The problem was the structure itself. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was built on an illusion. The massive, roaring fire in the cast-iron stove didn't heat the house. It created a temporary bubble of warmth in the immediate vicinity. a bubble that was constantly being destroyed. The physics were simple and brutal. The hot air produced by the stove was buoyant. It rose immediately to the uninsulated ceiling, where its heat was rapidly conducted through the thin boards to the freezing air outside. To fill the void left by this rising hot air, cold, dense outside air was pulled in through 1,000 tiny gaps in the floorboards, walls, and window frames. This process, known as the stack effect, turned every standard cabin in Cypress Canyon into a giant, inefficient pump, actively pulling the cold inside. The hotter the fire, the faster the pump worked. The families were burning through cords of wood and tons of coal not to heat their homes, but to accelerate the rate at which their homes lost heat. Their neighbors, the O'Malleys, the Bianchis, all suffered the same fate. They were fighting a battle against thermodynamics, and they were losing. They were trying to overpower the cold with brute force, throwing more and more fuel on the fire, while the real enemy, uncontrolled air movement and thermal conductivity, was left completely unaddressed. Kyriakos watched this all with the analytical eye of a mason. He saw his neighbors fighting the air, fighting the temperature. This, he knew, was a fool's errand. You did not fight the mountain. You did not fight the winter. You worked with them. You used their own immense power to your advantage. He knew from his childhood in the rock-cut villages of Cappadocia that the earth itself was a massive thermal battery. Deep underground or deep inside a mountain, the temperature was constant, a stable 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This was the gift of thermal mass. A small fire in a cave room in Gurame didn't have to fight a 20-degree Desarge exterior. It only had to raise the temperature from the cave's stable 50-degree Desarge base. This was the principle behind his folly. The construction that the camp mocked was, in reality, an act of profound engineering insight. Kyriakos began by leveling a floor area inside the sandstone overhang. He then built his 14-foot A-frame, a simple, strong design. But the genius was in the details of its placement. The walls of his little cabin did not touch the rock of the cave at any point. He maintained a clear, deliberate gap of 3 feet on all sides, between his wooden walls and the sweeping back wall of the cave, and between his roof and the stone ceiling of the overhang. Jedediah Potts had pointed at this gap with scorn. Look at that! Wasting all that space. Why not build right up against the rock? Get some of that stone to hold your walls up. Kyriakos just shook his head and said, "The air must be free." This 3-foot gap was the most critical element of the entire design. It was a zone of decoupling. Kyriakos knew that the sandstone, while a phenomenal thermal mass, would also sweat or condense moisture as the temperature fluctuated. If his wooden walls were directly against the rock, that moisture would be wicked into the lumber, causing rot and transmitting the damp chill directly into the living space. The 3-foot air gap ensured that the cabin existed within its own separate dry microclimate. The house was in the cave, but not of it. He built the A-frame with tongue and groove pine, creating a nearly airtight interior shell. There was only one opening, a single, insulated metal flue for his small stove, which snaked up and out toward the mouth of the cave, so the smoke would be carried away by the prevailing winds. Finally, he addressed the largest remaining gap, the space between the peak of his A-frame's roof and the high, curved ceiling of the cave. He and Eleni spent a week mixing clay, water, and straw to create a thick, adobe-like mud. They packed this mixture into the gap, creating a perfect, insulated seal. Halvor Bjorgen's official objection was on legal grounds, the mine safety setback. But his real professional criticism was rooted in conventional building science. When he filed his full report, he wrote, "The subject has created a structure that maximizes, rather than minimizes, exposure to the worst elements of cave dwelling. By leaving a 3-foot air gap, he has created a convection loop that will circulate cold, damp air around his dwelling. By building in a north-facing overhang, he has guaranteed zero solar gain. The structure is, by any professional measure, a thermally indefensible design destined for catastrophic failure in winter conditions." Kyriakos read the official citation, folded it neatly, and placed it on the small shelf he had just finished. He said to Eleni, who watched him with worried eyes, "He sees a hole in the ground. He does not see the mountain." The physics Bjorgen failed to grasp was the physics of nested systems. The A-frame cabin was not being exposed to the 30-degree F ambient temperature of a Colorado winter. It was being exposed only to the air inside the cave, and the air inside the cave was being conditioned by the immense thermal battery of the sandstone bluff. Let's break down the numbers. A cubic foot of sandstone weighs approximately 135 pounds. The overhang Kyriakos chose was 24 feet deep, over 100 feet wide, and part of a cliff face hundreds of feet thick. He was nesting his home within millions of tons of rock. This massive reservoir of stone had been absorbing the warmth of the summer for months. As winter approached, its surface temperature would drop, but its deep, internal temperature would remain remarkably stable, hovering around 50 degrees. The A-frame cabin, therefore, never had to fight the wind. The wind could howl down Cypress Canyon at 50 miles per hour, but inside the cave, the air was almost perfectly still. The cabin never had to fight the brutal 30-degree F ambient temperature. The air in the 3-foot gap surrounding the cabin would slowly cool, but it was constantly being warmed by radiant heat from the 50-degree F rock walls. In essence, the outside temperature for the A-frame was never lower than the 45-50 degree F of the cave's interior. Kyriakos' small, efficient stove didn't need to fight a 100-degree temperature differential from 30-degree Mars outside to 70 degrees inside. It only had to fight a 20-degree differential from the cave's 50 degrees to the desired 70 degrees. This meant he could achieve a comfortable 65-70 degree interior temperature with a fraction of the fuel his neighbors were burning. The airtight construction of the A-frame prevented the stack effect, and the straw mud seal at the top prevented heat from escaping into the upper reaches of the cave. He hadn't built a house. He had built a warm, dry kernel inside a massive, stable, geological shell. The winter of 1926-1927 arrived not as a gentle slide, but as a hammer blow. In mid-January, a polar vortex, a phrase not yet in common use, broke free of its Arctic moorings and descended upon the Rocky Mountains. For 10 consecutive nights, the temperature in Cypress Canyon did not rise above 34 degrees. A relentless 20-mile-per-hour downslope wind blew from the peaks of the Sangre de Cristos, driving the wind chill to levels that were not just uncomfortable, but life-threatening. Each dawn brought a thick, sub-zero fog that coated every surface in a layer of feathery, crystalline rime. In the main camp, it was a state of siege. The O'Malley's youngest child developed a hacking cough that echoed through the thin walls of their shack. The family spent their nights fully clothed, rotating shifts to keep their stove roaring, feeding it precious coal in a desperate attempt to keep the interior temperature above freezing. Their windows were opaque with inch-thick ice on the inside. The Bianchi's water pump froze solid, and the main pipe leading from it burst with a loud crack in the night. By the third day, most families had abandoned any pretense of normal life and simply huddled in a single room, their world reduced to the small, flickering circle of warmth around their overworked stove. The wind was a constant scream, a physical assault on the flimsy cabins. In the cave, there was silence. The wind howled at the mouth of the overhang, but inside, where the A-frame stood, The air was still. Kyriakos would stand in the 3-foot gap, holding a candle, and the flame would burn perfectly upright, not even a flicker. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white. Inside, it was calm. The true test, the ultimate proof, wasn't measured by a thermometer. It was measured in the mundane details of a functioning household. One evening, during the worst of the cold snap, Eleni was kneading dough for pita bread on their small wooden table in the center of the cabin. She wore a simple cotton dress. The children, Nikos and Sophia, were on the floor playing a game with polished stones. The air was warm, smelling of yeast and the gentle heat from the stove, which glowed with a low, steady burn. On a shelf near the door, next to Bjorgen's citation, sat a large earthenware crock. Inside was a piece of pasterma, a traditional Anatolian cured beef, a specialty of Kyriakos' homeland. It was heavily spiced with cumin, fenugreek, and garlic, and air-cured to a specific texture. In the other cabins, any cured meats had long since frozen solid, the fat and moisture turning them white and hard as rock. They would remain that way until the spring thaw. But in the steady, dry, 50-degree environment of the cave home's cellar, the 3-foot gap, the pasterma remained perfect. It was a deep, rich red, pliable, and ready to be sliced thin. Every evening, Kyriakos would shave off a few paper-thin slices. The fact that he could do this, that a piece of cured meat could remain sliceable through the heart of a polar vortex, was a more profound testament to his success than any temperature reading. It was proof of a completely different reality. Halvor Bjorgen was a man of duty. The eviction notice for Papadakis was a loose end, and the brutal weather only strengthened his resolve to see the family removed from their dangerous, illegal dwelling for their own safety. In late January, with the cold snap at its peak, he strapped on a pair of snowshoes and set out on his district circuit. His plan was to check on the more isolated camps and, on his way, deliver the final eviction order to the stubborn Greek. The journey was harrowing. The wind drove snow into his face, freezing his eyelashes and mustache into a mask of ice. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that seemed to suck the very life out of the air. As dusk fell, his carbide hand lamp, its metal contracting in the extreme cold, seized up. The valve froze shut. He was plunged into a disorienting blue twilight, still a mile from the main camp. He knew he was in trouble. The only shelter nearby was Papadakis' folly. Cursing the Greek, the cold, and his own bad luck, Bjorgen stumbled toward the sandstone bluff. He expected to find a tomb. He imagined a frozen family, a dead fire, the grim reality he had predicted. As he neared the cave mouth, he was surprised to see a faint, steady light. There was no smoke. He pushed through the snowdrift at the entrance and stood in the relative calm of the overhang. The cold was still profound, but the wind was gone. Before him stood the absurd little A-frame, its single window glowing with a warm, yellow light. He was shaking with cold, his gloved hands numb. He pounded on the small wooden door. "Papadakis, it's Bjorgen! Open up!" The door swung open. It didn't creak on frozen hinges. It moved smoothly, and then the air hit him. It was not a blast of hot, smoky air like one would expect from a cabin with a roaring fire. It was a gentle, almost imperceptible wave of warmth. But more than warmth, it was the stillness. It was calm, dry, and smelled of baking bread. Kyriakos stood in the doorway, wearing a simple shirt, his face showing concern, not surprise. Bjorgen stood there for a moment, utterly disoriented. He had prepared himself for the biting cold of a failed shelter. He expected to feel a draft, to see his breath plume. but the air inside the doorway was as still as a summer afternoon. He put his bare hand on the doorframe, expecting to feel the biting cold of frosted wood. It was cool, but it was dry. It felt like wood inside a house, not wood on the edge of a 34-degree or Fahrenheit apocalypse. He stepped inside. The sense of dislocation was overwhelming. He saw Eleni at the table, her hands covered in flour. He saw the two children look up from their game on the floor, their cheeks rosy, wearing light wool sweaters. He saw the small stove barely glowing. He saw the crock of pasterma on the shelf. He saw a normal home, functioning with an impossible ease in the middle of an Arctic nightmare. All his professional certainty, all his knowledge of BTUs and R values, all his regulations and reports dissolved in the face of this simple, warm, quiet reality. He looked at Kyriakos, his voice raspy from the cold. "How?" Kyriakos simply gestured around the small room. "The mountain. It is the first wall. This is the second." Bjorgen stayed for an hour, sipping a hot, sweet tea that Eleni prepared. He didn't talk about the citation, he just watched, and he felt. He felt the absence of drafts. He felt the even, radiant warmth. He walked to the wall and placed his palm against it. It was warm to the touch. He was witnessing a miracle of physics, a perfect system he had been trained to believe was impossible. When he left, he walked over to the shelf and picked up the citation he had issued months before. He looked at Kyriakos, then tore the paper into 4 clean pieces and dropped them into the kindling box next to the stove. "You didn't build a shelter in a cave, Papadakis," Bjorgen said, his voice full of a new, quiet respect. "You asked the mountain to be your house, and it said yes." The story of the warm cave house spread through the frozen camps like a folk tale. After the winter broke, Halvor Bjorgen himself became its most unlikely advocate. He spoke of it at the mine office, not as a violation, but as an innovation. The most powerful proof, the one that convinced the other Greek families, was the pasterma. When neighbors visited in March, they saw the deep red, perfectly preserved, cured beef, while their own stocks of cured pork had been frozen white and useless for months. It was a tangible, edible symbol of a different way of living. That April, the Trinidad, Colorado chapter of the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, AHEPA, Chapter 1-58, dedicated a page of its monthly newsletter to the Papadakis cave frame method. It included a simple diagram drawn by Kyriakos and a testimonial from a converted Halvor Bjorgen. By the autumn of 1927, 4 other Cappadocian Greek families in the Sopris and Aguilar coal camps had identified suitable rock overhangs and had built their own variations of the cave A-frame. The idea was spreading, not through official channels, but through the trusted networks of community and shared heritage. Decades later, the principles Kyriakos Papadakis demonstrated would be given formal names by architects and engineers. They would call it earth-sheltered construction, passive solar design, and thermal mass coupling. They would write complex equations to describe the behavior of heat in large, stable masses. They would champion super-insulated, airtight homes as the future of energy-efficient building. But all they were really doing was rediscovering the ancient wisdom that a rock-cut mason from Anatolia carried in his hands and in his blood. The story of Kyriakos Papadakis is a quiet testament to the power of looking at a problem differently. The other settlers saw the cold as an enemy to be fought with fire. They saw the frontier as a thing to be conquered and subdued. Kyriakos saw the immense, immovable power of the mountain not as an obstacle, but as an ally. He didn't build a cabin against the cold. He asked the mountain's cave to be the outer wall, and then he simply slept inside the second. It is a profound lesson in humility and ingenuity, a reminder that sometimes the most elegant solution is not to build a better shield, but to find a stronger partner. The frontier did not reward abstract theory or rigid regulation. It rewarded what worked. And in the heart of the freezing Colorado winter, the warm, quiet cabin inside the stone proved that nothing worked better than wisdom. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found this exploration of historical ingenuity as fascinating as I did, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps us continue to unearth these incredible stories. And let me know in the comments, what other forgotten building techniques do you think deserve to be remembered? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and thermal dynamics. Any modern application of earth-sheltered or unconventional building methods should be undertaken in full compliance with current local building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.